More than 9 years ago, just actually 9 years ago, a couple of weeks ago, on March 22nd, 2003, Alice Ross, a 71-year-old wife and grandmother, was tragically killed as a result of a staged auto accident in my former city council district. This is the picture of Alice. The accident was arranged and intentionally committed by individuals hoping to cash in on the accident by filing fraudulent insurance claims. At the time, the young man was convicted, who perpetrated the fraud, was convicted of manslaughter in the second degree in the Queen's Supreme Court, and his appeal was denied, forcing him to serve his sentence. Just recently, authorities charged almost 36 people with racketeering and money laundering in the largest ever fraud case involving the state's no-fault insurance law. The law requires payments of up to $50,000 for victims in an auto accident, regardless of fault. Insurance companies suffered a loss of almost $113 million. Thankfully, no deaths have been reported or associated with this particular fraud scheme. Not only does this result in a huge loss of revenue for the state of New York, but the idea that a person's life was tragically taken from her is unacceptable. Seniors are especially vulnerable to being targeted in these types of schemes because perpetrators believe they are less likely to be confrontational or dispute an accident. No-fault insurance fraud happens more frequently than most New Yorkers are aware of. In a study released last year, conducted by the Insurance Research Council, almost 20% of all no-fault claims in 2010 had some element of fraud. Almost 20%, I'll repeat that, of all no-fault claims in 2010 had elements of fraud. I'm proud to have introduced a bill, Assembly 6177, sponsored by Senator Seward, who's head of the Insurance Committee in the Senate, which we've dubbed Alice's Law, to pay homage to the woman who unfortunately lost her life back on March 22nd, 2003. This law would impose tougher criminal penalties on those who engage in staged accidents. A person would be guilty of staging a motor vehicle accident in the second degree, punishable as a Class C felony, if he or she commits the offense of staging a motor vehicle accident in the third degree and has previously been convicted of an insurance fraud crime within the preceding 5 years. A person would be guilty of staging in the first degree, punishable as a Class B felony, if a person commits the offense of staging in the third degree and causes serious personal injury or death to another person other than a participant in such offense. It's time to send a clear message to those perpetrators and would-be perpetrators of fraud that seek to cash in on dangerous auto accidents that could potentially lead to the injury or death of another individual. It's time to pass Alice's Law now. I now would like to hear from David Schwartz, as I mentioned, a former assistant DA in Kings County, Brooklyn, who heads up a group called New Yorkers Against Insurance Fraud. David.
Thank you, Assemblyman Weprin, and thank you for all you do for the people of the state of New York in protecting them. This is an epidemic that's going on of real epic proportions. Think about that number, 20% that Assemblyman Weprin gave you, 20%. And now picture 400,000 cases filed every single year. And now picture a football stadium filled with 80,000 people, 20% of 400,000. That's how much insurance fraud, that's how much no-fault fraud is going on every single year. That's the amount of people committing this. They are using cars as weapons. Think about this. People, those 80,000 people are involved in some kind of fraud using cars as a weapon, a dangerous instrument. How in this society, how a society of law and order could allow 80,000 of these incidents to happen every single year? Does that make any sense to you? Does that make any sense that a logical piece of legislation sponsored by Assemblyman Weprin is having so many problems becoming law right away? Does that make any logical sense? We have to ask our legislature, we have to ask the governor to pass this legislation right this second to stop the epidemic. Of course it needs to be a felony to commit insurance, to crash a car with the intent of committing insurance fraud. Of course. I mean, who could dispute that? And then if you do it again within 5 years, it bumps it up to a C felony. How could anyone argue with that? Show me the opposition to this logical piece of legislation. And then, if you commit a car accident with the intent of committing insurance fraud, and then a serious physical injury occurs or death, how could that not be a B felony? It makes no logical sense whatsoever, and that's what NYSAIF is all about. New Yorkers stand against insurance fraud. We are going to challenge our political leaders to pass this one piece of logical legislation. This should be a low-hanging fruit. There should be no debate over this piece of legislation. And why people stand in the way, why are there certain obstructionist forces out there standing in the way of this logical piece of legislation? It makes no sense. Government sometimes is still dysfunctional, and we need to pass this legislation. And I'm just so happy that we have champions like Assemblyman Weprin in the Assembly and most of his other colleagues, because I can guarantee you that, you know, we speak to the members of the Assembly, members of the Senate. If this bill hits the floor, it's going to pass with flying colors. This bill is going to be overwhelmingly passed. So you have to ask yourself, why isn't this bill on the floor? And we need to get it on the floor of the Assembly for passage. And we are going to fight to the end, on the part of New Yorkers stand against insurance fraud. We are going to fight until this bill is passed. And it's not just this bill. There's a whole load of other bills which need to be passed also. But we need to get this one first. Every single New York City district attorney supports this bill. Both Long Island district attorneys support this bill. Not only do they support it, they say they need this bill. So again, thank you, Assemblyman Weprin, for sponsoring such an important piece of legislation that's going to finally put a dent in no-fault insurance fraud and not only save the state of New York hundreds of millions of dollars, but also save lives. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. We'd be happy to answer any questions.
What introduced last year? What happened exactly? What stuff like?
It came to the end of session. It did pass in the Senate, and it got tied up in the Codes Committee. Did we get it? Was it start in the Codes Committee?
It's in the Codes Committee right now. It's sitting in Codes.
And you mentioned that there were groups that are opposing it. Which groups are you talking about? Like, can you be more specific in what they're arguing?
Well, look, there's a lot of groups that want a comprehensive reform. Okay, they want to be at the table for a comprehensive reform, and our argument is, the trial lawyers, okay, I'm going to say it straight out, that the trial lawyers want to make this part of a comprehensive issue, when at least on behalf of New Yorkers Stand Against Insurance Fraud, our argument is, this is an emergency piece of legislation. This has nothing to do with this whole broad platform that needs to take place. When you have Assemblyman Weprin, sponsoring a bill that's going to enhance the penal code, and every single New York City DA wants it, this should have nothing to do with some of the larger, more theoretical, intellectual conversations that are taking place on how we handle these cases. This is a different bill altogether, and that's why this should not be lumped with the larger conversation. It should be passed on its own merits.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why the district attorneys are supporting it is, under current law, it's very hard to prosecute these staged accidents if it doesn't result in serious injury or death, because the act itself of staging the accident is not a crime in itself. Obviously, if you commit insurance fraud later on, or if you cause serious bodily harm to someone with an intent, that's certainly a crime. But the act of actually staging the accident, just a fake accident, is not a crime under New York State law.
And this would change that? Like this?
This would make it a crime in itself. It would be a felony in and of itself, the act of actually staging the accident.
Yeah, we don't have a crime which articulates this criminal act. If you're a driver that you're the target of this. And you know, no fault.
Well, I think if anything, it might be the senior population, because seniors are often more vulnerable to fraud in general,
Sure.
and they're probably less likely to dispute, an accident than younger people. So if you had to pick one group that's probably targeted more and more vulnerable, is the senior population.
I mean, our challenge right now is for people to fully understand how serious this crime is. I mean, just think about, strapping those kids in the back seat, and you got the car seat and the family's going out. And there are people out there right now looking to use their car as a weapon. Does that make any sense to any logical, law-abiding person at all? That's why we need this law. And also, the no-fault law in general was very well-intentioned. It was to give people the relief right away for their medical injuries. But when the law was written, who knew that criminal enterprises would pop up and start taking advantage of a window of opportunity of up to $50,000 a pop? And that's why we have to stop this right now.
I had something right now.
So it's going to be in
It's going to be in the neighborhood. Which would be more quantity. That's our family show. That's for tomorrow, Bill?